All right, people are coming into the webinar, so let's get this started. I would like to thank everyone for coming and joining us here at the Kurdish Peace Institute virtually for our first event. We really appreciate people joining in and having this essential conversation, unfortunately, on the very timely issue of Turkey's threats against North and East Syria. So just for a few quick housekeeping issues, this is a webinar. You'll be able to send questions to our panelists at the end through the Q&A. It will be recorded and you will be able to watch it on our website, kurdishpeace.org, later, hopefully today or tomorrow. So Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has recently threatened to carry out a third military operation against the autonomous administration of North and East Syria and the Syrian Democratic Forces. Two previous attacks, one in 2018 targeting the northwestern Syrian region of Afrin, and one in 2019 against al-Ain and Tel Abyad in northeastern Syria, led to serious civilian harm, destabilized the region, harmed the counter-ISIS campaign, and put the possibility of ending not only Syria's 10-year civil war, but Turkey's own 40-year conflict with armed Kurdish groups even further out of reach. A third attack would likely have even more serious impacts on all of these crucial humanitarian, security, and human rights concerns. Just this morning, Turkish president threatened to attack Manbij, a diverse city whose 2016 liberation from ISIS was a key success story of the SDF's counter-ISIS campaign, as well as Tel Rifaat, which is home to tens of thousands of internally displaced people who were forced out of Afrin in 2018. So our panelists here need no introduction for their work, but I'm going to do one anyway. They're going to discuss why Turkey is making these threats now, what could be done to prevent a new assault, and what will happen if one's not prevented, and how we can get out of these tragedies and try to peacefully resolve conflicts in both countries. So joining us today, we'll have Hadil Uis. Hadil is a senior research fellow at the Philos Project with a focus on Syria. At the age of 19, she was arrested by the Assad regime for playing a key role in the early days of the Syrian protests. In 2012, she relocated to the United States. Hadil currently analyzes US policies in the Middle East for major Arabic networks and hosts a weekly show that focuses on current issues in the Middle East. We'll also be joined by Dr. Liesl Hintz, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. After receiving her PhD in political science from George Washington University, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University and taught at Barnard College, Columbia University. Her current book project examines state society struggles over identity in Turkey through the lens of pop culture. Her first book, Identity Politics Inside Out, National Contestation and Foreign Policy in Turkey, investigates how domestic contestation over various forms of identity spills over to shape and be shaped by foreign policy. And finally, we'll be joined from on the ground in Syria by Şener Sido, a human rights activist based in Shaba, northwestern Syria, and originally from Afrin. A graduate of Syria's Aleppo University, she has extensive experience working as a teacher and a translator. She also previously worked with the Kurdish Red Crescent and the human rights organization Afrin, where she provided support for at-risk IDPs and prepared high-quality documentation of human rights abuses carried out against civilians during the invasion and occupation of Afrin, where she is from and from which she was displaced. She's currently working with women-led Middle Eastern news agency Jinha, and is coordinating training sessions for teachers, doctors, and parents groups for psychological support projects in collaboration with Columbia University. And of course, I'll be your moderator today. My name is Megan Baudet, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Kurdish Peace Institute. So with that, let's get right to discussing these threats this morning and the broader political and security situation behind them. So Hadil, why don't you explain for us what the overall political and security situation in North and East Syria has been like for the past 2.5 years since Operation Peace Spring, the last Turkish invasion, ended in October 2019 with negotiated ceasefires that have seen some real challenges since then?
Yes, thank you, Megan, and thank you, Liesl and Schiller, and for everyone attending today. When we talk today about Northeast Syria, we're talking about a divided region after the invasion of 2019. It's divided between Turkey-backed militias that control Ras al-Ain and Tel Abyad, and between SDF and the autonomous administration that controls the largest part of Northeast Syria. If I start by talking about the areas that are controlled by Turkey and Turkey-backed groups, life there is very chaotic. The latest news we're getting from there is that many militiamen that are all supported by Turkey and backed by Turkey are experiencing internal fighting for things, competition about the treasures, about about gaining areas in these areas. So these areas experience a lot of internal conflicts. Many of these militiamen were killed recently. We also heard in the news from Turkish news that Turkey had to intervene to stop the clashes between these groups that they armed and backed to control these areas. This is the situation of Ras al-Ain and Tel Abyad, these areas that are controlled by Turkey. On the other hand, there is the autonomous administration and SDF controlled areas, and in these areas, unfortunately, despite they are experiencing a lot of hardship. The first hardship, I would say, is that they have no crossing borders. They don't have crossing borders, official crossing borders with any of the neighboring countries, Turkey, Iraq, Kurdistan of Iraq, to bring the essentials for the people, to bring humanitarian aid for the people. So it's surrounded by countries that wouldn't open borders with the SDF controlled areas. After also the incursion of 2019, Turkey was able to control the water resources, and saying that Turkey since 2019 is using water also as a weapon against Northeast Syria. The drone attacks against Northeast Syria, SDF controlled areas, would never stop since 2019. There is continuous targeting for the autonomous administration areas, which is unstabilizing the region. But despite all of that, if we compare it with other areas that are controlled by Turkey-backed groups in Syria, there is a system, there is a political system, there is a government, and there is always attempts and efforts to try to stabilize the region. Recently, we all heard about the exemptions, the US exemptions from the Caesar sanctions that would be applied in Northeast Syria. But unfortunately, right after this announcement by the US that gave the people of Northeast Syria a hope that the economic situation would improve despite of having no crossing borders and no countries that are aiding them, we started to hear about Turkey threats to the region again to make a new operation in the region. So all in all, I would say Northeast Syria today, controlled by the autonomous administration, is one of the best regions in Syria when it comes to stability, when it comes to combating terrorism, when it comes to efforts to maintain at least the minimum amount of accountability, of political system, of course equality between men and women, but a lot of circumstances are not helping this region. And of course the key issue is the Turkey continuous threats.
Thank you very much, Hadil, for that great backgrounder on what's going on in North and East Syria in both SDF and Turkish-controlled areas. So now if we move across the border, we're going to take a look at what's been going on in Turkey. So Liesl, for you, if you'd like to tell us about what the political situation in Turkey has been like during those past few years, and in particular, what political dynamics have driven Turkey's recent interventionist policy in Syria?
Sure. Thank you so much, Megan. Thanks for organizing this. Congrats to you and Giran and the whole team for setting up this great platform. It's an honor to speak alongside Hadil and Shilar. And obviously, this is a very timely event, timely opportunity to examine some of these potentially impending issues. So if we're thinking back to the time of Operation Peace Spring 2019, the fall of 2019, in terms of the domestic political context in Turkey and the ruling Justice and Development Party and their attempts to try to remain in power, what you just seen is a real sort of earthquake, I think, in terms of their belief that they can hold on to power. You've seen and I think this really underscores the importance of local politics in domestic politics, in foreign policy. You've just seen these opposition victories in municipalities in 2019 that were unexpected, that the AKP didn't think that the Republican People's Party, the CHP, was going to be able to pull off these opposition victories in Ankara, and most importantly in Istanbul. And so when the AKP is looking ahead to, and again, thinking just sort of about the domestic political context, when the AKP is looking ahead to elections, which it very much needs to win, and that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, I think from an existential perspective, very much needs to remain in power as autocrats who are engaging in processes of authoritarian consolidation and crony capitalism and oppression of the opposition and all of those things. There are increasing reasons why they desperately need to stay in power. We're very much seeing that at this point. We're looking ahead to elections scheduled for 2023. And what the AKP saw is that they don't have the hold on politics that they thought. And I think the opposition being able to win those local elections in 2019 was a real sort of wake-up call. And in fact, the Kurdish issue in Turkey is intimately tied into this, into the opposition's ability to potentially challenge the AKP, not only at the local level, but at the national level as well. We know that the Kurdish vote was key, was instrumental in the opposition's ability to secure a victory in Istanbul. And we also know that the individual, or one of the key individuals in securing that vote, Canan Kaftancıoğlu, has just received a ban from politics. So I think this really underscores the importance of the Kurdish issue in Turkey, of the way in which the AKP sees Kurds as a political threat, not just a security threat. And we can unpack why they see, the threats in the way that they do, but the sense that Kurds can upend the AKP's ability to hang on to power. And this goes back to 2015. I know we're talking about the current context, but if we're thinking about the People's Democratic Party, the HDP's ability to unseat the AKP's parliamentary majority for the first time in the 2015 elections. You see, in response, a hard nationalist turn, the end of the peace process with the Kurds, an informal coalition with the Nationalist Action Party, the MHP. You see policies against Kurds in terms of jailing politicians, in terms of removing democratically elected mayors, in terms of rhetoric that is vilifying, that is painting with, supporting terrorism, paintbrush, anyone who happens to be of Kurdish origin and is in the opposition. This is a tool that the AKP uses regularly. Sieges, military operations, all of this. So I think 2015 is really key in understanding how we've gotten where we are in terms of the painting of Kurdish opposition as a terrorist threat, and the challenge of that for not only for Kurds, but for the opposition more broadly, is that this becomes a political tool to try to divide the opposition, to try to make sure that what happened in 2019 doesn't happen again in 2023. So I know we'll get to the question of sort of why now, and why are we seeing this particular threatened incursion? And of course, there are regional dynamics. There are lots of different sort of levels of analysis that we could address that question at. But, thinking ahead to elections, thinking ahead to the economic crisis that we're seeing in Turkey, that means that the AKP has lost a lot of support, not only for the economic crisis and the pandemic's exacerbation of that, and Russia's invasion war against Ukraine and how that has exacerbated economic conditions, but also the mismanagement of monetary policy and other ways in which the AKP has lost support. So I think we can't understand the sort of current threats of a future military operation in Syria without understanding the domestic politics and the way in which elections are looming large for the AKP.
All right, well, thank you again so much for that background on the Turkish side of things. We could do an entire other event on some of those dynamics you brought up, whether that was Istanbul in 2019 or the HDP's success in 2015. But moving back over to our last bit of background to really understand this crisis, Şiler, why don't you tell us what are conditions like in the areas of Syria that Turkey has already invaded and currently controls, like Afrin, and these regions that have been invaded in these previous operations? What's it like on the ground? Why should we be concerned about this?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so happy to be with you today. I'm sorry I turned off my camera because of the bad internet connection here on the ground. You know, first of all, we should know that the Turkish armed forces and its ally, the Syrian National Army, have occupied areas of northern Syria since August 2016 during the Syrian civil war. Turkish-controlled areas of Syria comprise 8,835 square kilometers. You know, it includes towns like Afrin, Al-Bab, Jarablos, Azaz, Tel Abyad, al-Ain. These settlements have been captured from ISIS and SDF controlled areas by Turkey, and the Syrian government oppositions are referred to as safe zone. And let's define safe zone here according to Turkish dictionaries. You know, the occupation has led to human rights crimes, including ethnic cleansing, especially in the areas between Kobani and Afrin. Of course, the creation of safe zone failed from the very beginning. Why? Because the humanitarian conditions of civilians are the worst documented ever. And I'm not exaggerating, because there are tens of international reports that prove what I'm saying here. Leave alone the international reports. At the end, I'm an activist and I'm on the ground and I witness everything. The areas are demographically changed, especially in Afrin, Tel Abyad and al-Ain with Kurdish majority. In general, Arab fighters' families were resettled in homes and lands belonging to the indigenous people, most Kurds or Yazidis. There is an organized, systematic demographic change in the region controlled by Turkey and its factions. The population of Turkish-dominated territories is generally Muslim, while Kurds, Christians, Armenians, and Assyrians generally fled in advance of fear. Why? Because they have already experienced Turkish crimes, and we all know the Armenian genocide. It's there, and we can't forget that. Civilians, especially women, in the controlled areas face rape, forced marriage, sexual assaults, torture, imprisonment, forced Islamic clothes like niqab. They don't have a freedom to go out as they want to express themselves. I can talk for days about civilians' conditions and how freedom of religion is oppressed, how civilians, especially the indigenous people, face a lot of physical and psychological abuses. Even the Arabs who cooperated with Erdogan and believed that Erdogan war is legitimate, and they started to demonstrate just 2 days before this panel and this Zoom meeting. We had demonstrators calling Erdogan out of Syria and screaming that these areas, especially in Idlib, the very controlled area by Turkey, calling out in demonstrations. People marched there. In Al-Bab, they said, Erdogan out of Syria. There are videos documenting what I'm saying. In general, civilians cannot put up with the situation anymore. Turkey's controlled areas now is called drugs, guns, chaos area. So in general, it's hell, and it's getting worse day by day.
Well, thank you for that very disturbing picture of the situation. I think we need to understand that reality, because when you hear kind of the rhetoric in media, and even, unfortunately in some analysis, people talk in broad terms of safe zones and, security interests, when what we can see on the ground is that people in these regions, simply are not safe and they're not secure. And especially as we've seen threats from Turkey, not only to displace the original populations of these regions, but to move Syrian refugees who are living in Turkey in violation of international law on refugee protection. These conditions simply aren't conditions that people should be living in. So thank you, Shalair, for explaining that. We're going to move back over to Liesl, talking about, as you predicted in your earlier explainer of what was going on in Turkey, why now? Why is Turkey threatening to invade again at this particular point in time? And what might be the political impacts that we would see within Turkey if a new large-scale operation against North and East Syria in the regions that have been threatened recently were to take place?
Yeah, so I think it's the key question, why now? And I think the question of why now really gets to the question of the different factors that are shaping this particular incursion, that in fact domestic politics may play a role. I think we talk a lot about Turkey's security concerns, but if we're looking at why now, I think we need to understand the regional context and the domestic context. So I'm glad to be asked that question. Again, I think looming elections and the AKP's ability to hold on to power play a large role in this for a number of reasons that, in fact, Megan, you highlighted, and I think the Syrians present in Turkey are a part of that. Again, when you have economic crisis, when you have, falling numbers in terms of support at the polls, when you have a generation of youth who has grown up not knowing anything but the AKP, but not really seeing themselves in the AKP's vision for Turkey. The most recent polls show that I think about 30% of the youth that were surveyed were going to vote for the CHP, for the Republican People's Party. A large percentage were undecided, and only about 20-something percent were looking at voting for the AKP. So trying to have some kind of military campaign that can distract from economic woes, that can distract from frustrations with governance, frustrations with authoritarian behaviors of crackdowns on university campuses, on pretty much every form of protest that you can see. There's that element of distraction. There is the element of the nationalist rally round the flag effect that can be can be mustered up when you are attacking a threat that has been constructed in Turkish history books for decades, that has been recently identified and again vilified by the AKP, MHP, loose coalition government with repeated claims that Kurds are threatening the security of Turkey. So there's the nationalist bump that you can get by undertaking a military campaign against this particular group of people. So this very much has an identity politics component to it. We know that the CHP has at times objected to some of Turkey's military efforts in Syria, but at other times has approved of it. And we know that, again, this is sort of a policy that, like anti-US, anti-NATO, anti-Western rhetoric, can unite a number of different nationalist groups. And that's precisely what the AKP needs to do in terms of elections, is unite a number of nationalist constituencies, ethnic nationalists, religious nationalists, and secular nationalists. And targeting Kurds can unfortunately do that. So there's the nationalist bump. And then there's the drive the wedge between the opposition that I talked about earlier, make it difficult for the 6 opposition parties that have united, several of which have been anti-Kurdish, perhaps even still today, but certainly in the past. I'm thinking of the EE party, highly nationalist party, at least in their previous affiliation with the MHP. So make it difficult for those groups to have any kind of outreach to the Kurds. So there's all of those domestic political considerations, but then there's the larger regional picture. And I think a lot of individuals have focused on the fact, obviously, that Russia is carrying out its military campaign, its invasion Ukraine and is sort of focusing all of its efforts there. And so that may open up a space for Turkey and Syria as well. But I think that we should also consider not just the fact that Russia's efforts are targeted more in Ukraine, but also the status bump that Turkey has gotten by the way that it is sort of handled or even played up its role as potential mediator in the Russia-Ukraine, in the international community's efforts to try to solve Russia's war in Ukraine, try to bring that to an end. And so very strategically, Erdogan has positioned Turkey as indispensable, as you need to reckon with us. We are uniquely positioned as friends of both Ukraine and Russia to be able to mediate this dispute, obviously not wanting to compromise or harm relationships on either side, but also the mediator role kind of geniusly doesn't allow Turkey to take sides, and that's a very convenient position for it to be in. So the fact that Turkey's position and relevance has been elevated, and you saw this with the German chancellor, the Israeli president, the Greek prime minister, that one has not gone so well. All of these meetings recognizing, giving Turkey this international platform as, force that needs to be reckoned with, regional actor that needs to be reckoned with, and perhaps an extension whose perception of security threats needs to be taken seriously. Now we look at Turkey's objection within NATO to Sweden and Finland's accession and the way that that's throwing a wrench in what could have been this historic development of these Scandinavian countries joining NATO. So Turkey, again and again, by its sort of rhetorical and strategic positioning in the international community, has made it very difficult, because it has been able to sort of demonstrate the leverage that it has in a number of different arenas, has made it difficult for the international community to express its objections, to try to prevent Turkey from undertaking this. And we did see the U.S. State Department, kind of going even past we're expressing deep concerns and so forth, and really try to signal that it would be unhappy with a new military incursion. And on the domestic politics side, really briefly, I'll wrap up with this. I'll just say that one change that I think is important from the 2019 context is that, at least in principle, the Biden administration has taken a much firmer stance on Turkey. I know human rights activists would like it to take an even firmer stance than it has. But if you look at the previous Turkish military operations in Syria, I don't think you can understand those completely without understanding the Trump-Erdogan relationship and sort of the way in which Trump was sending mixed signals of almost approval to Erdogan. So that is something that has changed. So again, domestic politics context, regional context, opportunity, as well as the potential to use this to divide the opposition vote in upcoming elections.
Thank you. Yeah, that's all very insightful. And definitely that difference in dynamics between what we saw with the Trump administration and with many of the individuals that Trump tasked with the Syria policy. We're not seeing that same approach from the Biden administration. And later in this event, we will get to that. But going off of that look at those dynamics in Turkey and regionally with Russia and Ukraine, to return back to Syria, if this operation does take place for all of these reasons that have been talking about, Shalera, could you tell us a little bit about what that would look like on the ground? If Turkey goes into Tel Rifaat and Manbij, what will that mean for Syrians? What will be happening in these regions if this invasion does occur?
Oh, yeah, of course, the consequences could be massive. We should know that Syrian crisis is getting more complicated by these threats. There are already so many forces on the ground. We have the Russians and the Iranians on the regime support as regime supporter and defender. On the other hand, we have the US and the coalition as ISIS and terrorist groups fighters. Now, when Turkey interfered, the Syrian situation became worse. Now, Syria is divided, as Hadil said, and when Turkey is allowed to invade 30 kilometers strip of territory, we will witness more division, clashes, and chaos. We already know how miserable people's lives are in Turkey's controlled areas. Invading more of Syria territories will add more agony to the political context and to the social people life, invading more of Syria. In fact, Turkey plans to get rid of the Syrian refugees in Turkey and bring them to the borderline in north in order to get rid of the Kurdish presence there. So there is a bigger plan, and Erdogan government always, look at places where Kurds are now, even in Tel Rifaat. We are displaced people. Hundreds of thousands live there. They are all civilians. At the same time, they see these displaced people as enemy and a threat. Shellings and bombings are daily. As I talk to you now, there are shellings. There are. And Syrian people are tired now. And they all agree that Turkey's new threats could lead to more displacement, could lead to more misery. And on the other hand, in October 22nd, 2019, Committee on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. assessed the impact of Turkey's offensive in northeast Syria by itself. Congressmen agreed that Turkey is not Iran or Russia. Turkey is an expansionist country who wants to control more and more of other countries' lands. Look at Iraq, look at Syria. So these ambitions Turkey that have, it's just similar to the colonial dream of bringing the Ottoman Empire. And where we are now, we are in the 21st century with these plans. I think that could not be happen. And it happened, and if Turkey was allowed to invade more, I think the consequences will be devastating, and the US interest and the Syrian people interest of a better future will all be blocked out by this new threats and implementing them on the ground.
Well, that was very powerfully stated. And I think you make the very important case that both in terms of basic security and stability for Syrians and in terms of international norms. When we have a situation where the entire world condemns Russia for invading Ukraine, for saying that Ukrainians aren't a people, that Ukraine is not a nation, it's not a state, and that it's their historic territory. But then the same international community looks at a government in Turkey that says that Kurds are not a people, that the other peoples of North and East Syria, Armenians, Assyrians, Yazidis, many of these other communities are not peoples, that they do not deserve to live in the lands where they live. And when the international community supports that same kind of expansionism and rhetoric of denial of the existence of these persecuted communities, that's a double standard, and that erodes these norms so that when other bad actors choose to take advantage of them, there's less of a precedent. So thank you for connecting that very powerful explanation of how deadly and dangerous this will be for Syrians like yourself to these big picture international issues. And while we're at this international level of analysis, going to some of the points that all three of you have made before, Hadil, how do you see US policy towards North and East Syria since October 2019? I know you've interviewed many US officials about this. What could the US have done better in the past to prevent tensions in the region from getting to the point where they are today?
Yes, I can certainly say that engagement by Washington under Biden administration with Northeast Syria, the level of understanding the dynamics of the region by Biden administration was better than if we compare it to what happened under Trump administration. But especially I want to mention here the latest decision to give Northeast Syria exemptions from the sanctions, but we want to make sure that these exemptions are useful, because if Erdogan is threatening the region, and if the region is going to be to experience another chaos, and as Schiller explained all the horrible consequences of a potential invasion, the exemptions won't be useful anyways, because it's basically hard anyways, even without this this potential incursion, and even without these threats, it's hard to attract investors. It's hard to attract foreign money to the region. And if this invasion is going to take place, it's going to be even harder to benefit from these exemptions. So the engagement was better under the Biden administration, but there is not like a fundamental, let's say, policy for the region. There is no policy, American policy under Biden or Trump for Syria in general, and of course also no policy for Northeast Syria or for the future of the autonomous administration. I think one very important thing that's absent here is engaging Northeast Syria, the autonomous administration, in the political process for Syria. Until today, I interviewed many officials, even from the current administration, and they're very hesitant and they are very careful when you ask them about engaging the autonomous administration in the Syria talks in Geneva. They have no answer. They say this is not our business. It's for the UN to do. So they're very hesitant to do so. I'm sure the US can do so. So this can push for more serious and official engagement for the autonomous administration as autonomous administration in the political talks. They would say that the Kurds are included, but the autonomous administration is not only Kurds, and it's and not all the Kurds would represent necessarily the majority of the people in the Northeast Syria. So this is not happening until today. There should be more attention for the region. There should be more understanding for the dangerous consequences of such an incursion by Turkey, because also, again, as Schiller mentioned, and the situation in Turkey controlled areas in northwest Syria or northeast Syria is horrible. It's not easy for the people, for not only for the Kurds but also for the Arabs. As someone who speak Arabic as my first language, who follow the news on daily basis, and I can follow the reaction of the Syrian refugees inside Turkey and what they think about a potential new incursion and Erdogan's promise to bring back refugees to Syria. The Syrians, the Arabs, the people from Damascus, from Homs, all these cities who are being pushed out of Turkey to go to what Erdogan is calling safe zones, are very horrified. They don't want to go and live in these areas because these areas are ruled in it's like gangs are ruling these areas. As I mentioned at the beginning of this conference, lately we've been hearing about clashes, internal clashes in al-Ain, and no one wants to live there. So these incursions won't even solve the issue of the refugees, won't make these areas more stable, won't help Turkey to send more refugees. First, it's sending these refugees is based on ethnically cleansing Kurds from their cities and replacing them by people who are not very willing to live in these areas. So this is also creating long-term problems for Syria, for the social connections and social the social contract of Syria and all. So the US should understand this more, and there should be more effort, more time spent on Syria and on Northeast Syria.
Thank you. That was a really important update on that situation. I like that you bring up that matter of social cohesion, of the tolerance and people being able to live together, because I think that's a common thread through all of this. People in Syria, people in Turkey would benefit from peace, from democracy, from coexistence. But unfortunately, due to local, regional, and international dynamics that virtually every state involved in these conflicts has a part in, that's sadly not the case. And certainly if this incursion happens, that situation will be worse. But while we're on the subject of the US role specifically, as we've discussed, the Biden administration has been very clear that it would oppose any military activity in Northeast Syria that violates the ceasefire lines from 2019. That's a big difference from the Trump administration. But at the same time, Biden has, for example, argued that Turkey should be sold F-16s, which we know it will use to bomb oftentimes populated areas when it carries out military operations like these ones in Syria. We know that many people have criticized the administration for being less vocal about human rights within Turkey than it had essentially promised to in the beginning. So it's a mixed bag. And when we look at the longer history of Biden's record and of both Democratic and Republican administrations through the NATO alliance and the US-Turkish alliance sort of supporting Turkey's all-out military solution to the Kurdish question, we can see that there's a lot of room for improvement and suggestions on US policy. So with that, I'm going to put it to all three of our panelists. If you could make one policy recommendation to the Biden administration right now to try to get us out of these crises in Syria and Turkey and improve the situation, what would that recommendation be? Hadil, you can start.
Yes, we've seen, maybe this is a big recommendation, but what we've seen in Ukraine when diplomats started to visit Kiev, when presidents, world leaders started to visit Kiev, it was a very important turning point. So I think giving Northeast Syria, the autonomous administration, a more advanced political status is very important. Having official US offices, consulate offices to open in the area would be very important, very helpful. And I think many of the US allies who are also friends with the autonomous administration will do so. And this will be a very important turning point, giving the autonomous administration a more official political status. And this, I don't mean by this dividing the region, dealing with Northeast Syria as a separate region, but having more official connections between the US and Northeast Syria, I think is going to be very important, because if we don't do something to stop this, what Erdogan wants to do, Erdogan now is trying to, yes, yes, someone mentioned that I can't see me in the video. I think my camera
You should
is
be
on.
spotlighted now. Sorry about that.
So if we don't do something like this, I think Erdogan is trying to make the threats to Northeast Syria, starting a new war and taking control of new areas is going to be the new normal, and this should stop. It just happened 2 years ago, and today he's threatening to do so. So maybe why not in 2 years, or maybe less than 2 years, who would make new threats and start a new operation and take more areas from Northeast Syria, and that will lead to all the consequences that we talked about before. So we should do something new. We should do something that would be a turning point, that would give the region more official recognition, that would stop these threats.
Thank you for that. Now, Liesl, what would you make your policy recommendation to the Biden administration to be?
Yeah, go beyond expressing deep concern, I guess, to start. I would say second, read Jihan Tuwal's op-ed in the New York Times last week, sociology professor from Berkeley, who makes a number of really important points. And I think one of the ones that really stands out and should stand out for the Biden administration is that I think within Turkey, there is a continuous effort to try to call out Western actors for supporting the Kurds. I think there's a belief that, and this fits in with this sort of nefarious external actor supporting the opposition rhetoric that the AKP likes to use, that, you know, European countries are recognizing Kurds and hosting asylum seekers, and they're meeting with Kurdish groups, and they're fomenting rebellion and secessionism and all kinds of kind of outdated tropes about what Kurds are actually engaging in. And so Professor Tuwal points to that, but says actually, in fact, you know, NATO and its military support of Turkey is implicated in Turkey's own military campaigns against the Kurds. And Megan, you brought up the point about the F-16s earlier. And I think the TB2 drones are another really important example of how Turkey's military hardware and how the ways in which the domestic defense industry has benefited from being in NATO, from its ties to European companies. We've seen, in fact, Turkey push for the lifting of arms embargoes because it wants to be able to continue to manufacture this military hardware. And where is it using it? In a lot of cases, it's using it in northern Iraq, and it's using it in northeast Syria, and it's using it in Turkey as well. So take seriously the extent to which Turkey is using how it benefits from NATO against Kurdish populations in multiple countries. And then I guess this is a much larger, and I'm abusing my privilege and giving a couple of recommendations, but because those were relatively small, I want to give a much bigger picture recommendation, which is to rethink immigration policy and the extent to which the Biden administration is accepting asylum seekers. And this goes back to the points that both Sheila and Hadil, I think, really smartly raised, which is that part of Erdogan's domestic politics is this claim that he's going to repatriate Syrians, that he's going to sort of put them back as though they weren't humans and rather cargo into a particular piece of territory that in fact isn't even a safe zone, and in most cases isn't where those Syrians are from in any case. And I think one of the grievances that Turkey has expressed to the international community, and I think legitimately, rightly so, is that Turkey has had to absorb a very large number of individuals because European countries, because the US, because other countries were not willing to accept more Syrians. I think it's really important to recognize that Syrians in Turkey are not refugees. They don't have legal refugee protection status. They're temporary guests. Turkey has a geographical reservation to the Refugee Convention. And Syrians in particular have now become a political tool of election campaigning, and opposition parties are picking up on this as well. But part of that is this larger structural problem of which countries accepted Syrians and which didn't. And I think, we talked a little bit earlier about the double standard, or the difference between the international community's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and to the Syrian question. And I think when it comes to refugees, we can point to a similar sort of double standard or very, very different treatment. And so I would say sort of rethink the extent to which you're open to accepting a lot more asylum seekers. And I think that will help on a humanitarian level, which I think is the most important, but it will also take away Turkey's ability to sort of play this moral card that we have accepted so many. And you should sort of recognize the burden, and I hate that word, but the responsibility that we've taken on in hosting this many Syrians. And it'll hopefully prevent them from becoming a political tool in the future.
Well, I'm glad that you went over and gave more recommendations, because that is all exceedingly important. I think you can never go wrong with a recommendation to do more to support refugees when you see how little is being done by so many countries. And I will also highlight again, everybody, please go to the New York Times. The op-ed is entitled "Turkey Shows What NATO Really Is." It's by Cihan Tual, who is a sociology professor. And if you want to understand how the war in northern Iraq, northern Syria, Turkey, these areas populated by Kurds, is really not just Turkey's war, but it's an international war. It's a NATO war. It's something that the United States has supported to a much higher degree than the very limited support it has provided to the Syrian Democratic Forces against ISIS. Read that op-ed. It makes all those points much more eloquently than I ever could. And honestly, I'm surprised to see something like that in the New York Times, but I'll take that as a sign that those of us who support peace and democracy are winning the narrative. And with that, I will go over to Sheila for your policy recommendations for the Biden administration.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I totally agree with Hadil and Ms. Hint. They really pointed out to very important recommendations. And I want to say that the US-Turkey relationship is complex and challenging one. It's very far from an easy relationship, especially when it comes to its partner SDF in northeast Syria. And the American forces are on the ground, American diplomats are on the ground in northeast Syria. High-level American officials visit the area every now and then. They witness everything on the ground. I know exactly what are Turkey's plans. They also know that the Turkish threats are not new ones. So they are there, and I do believe that the US, especially Biden administration, can play an essential role in order to bring peace, democracy, and coexistence in the region. I myself believe in the dialogue, even if it's between two enemies, even if it is between two different ideological parts, because we know it's not a war about guns and fighting between two sides. It's about two mentalities that are quite different from each other. We have the radical Islamic mentality that Turkey wants to impose on Syria, and we have the Kurdish, way of thinking that coexistence and a brotherhood is the key to solution in Syria. So two different mentalities here on the ground. And I myself, as an activist, I do believe in the dialogue, and I think it is important. So if the Biden administration could moderate talks between the Kurds and Turkey side to get rid of Turkey's allergy, it is historic. We have this Kurdish phobia issue that always bring Turkey to new threats, new invasions. It's always, the war on the death. So how about to start dialogue from this side to this side? And with dialogue, we can achieve more of peace talks, like peace talks. And it happens. I mean, we have so many examples in history where two enemies come together, they talk, they can make agreements to bring peace, because at the end, we have to think about the Syrians who are fed up with the ongoing war here, in the region. So I do believe this recommendation will work and will have great consequences. I do believe also if the dialogue couldn't work out or couldn't bring consequences, the US, with the lead of the US, I think having UN peacekeeping forces all along Turkish-Syrian border maybe could stop Turkish colonial ambitions, and maybe could bring stability, peace, democracy, and security to the region. This only could be done by the US help. Only the main factor in the Syrian, issue. And I do believe that we can, the Biden administration can do a lot and can work with the partners on the ground to bring peace to the region. Otherwise, we will have ongoing war to the forever. And this is not in the interest of any part who wants a better future for people, the Syrian people who endured a lot. So either dialogue or having UN peacekeeping forces on the border to just let know that Turkey don't attack or look for invading more of Syrian territories. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. There you've heard it from on the ground in Syria. What Syria needs is peace and diplomacy and dialogue. And Shiler, you'll know that what you said there about bringing Turkey and the Kurdish movement back to the table in order to ensure that there can be peace in northern Syria is a less controversial idea than a lot of people want to make it out to be. The 2019 report of the bipartisan Syria study group appointed by Congress found that the United States should, quote, encourage the resumption of Turkey-PKK peace talks, which hold the best possibility of leading to a détente between Turkey and the SDF. All the way back in the 1990s, as a senator, now President Joe Biden actually co-sponsored legislation that would have restricted US security assistance to Turkey under a variety of conditions, one of which that included, quote, demonstrable steps towards a peaceful resolution of the Kurdish issue. So that's not controversial. Syrians on the ground know that's true. When I was in North and East Syria last fall, I had a chance to interview General Mazloum, the commander of the SDF. He told me that peace in Turkey with international mediation would be something that could make a big difference in Syria. And again, as Shiler said, and as is echoed in Hadil's points, in Liesel's points, Syrians don't want endless war. Nobody wants these incursions. No one wants fighting and division. They want peace in their country and an end to all of these conflicts, these international clashes, these local clashes. And so really figuring out what a policy that ends these endless wars and works for peace and stability is important. There's kind of this dichotomy in Washington where people think that on Syria, you have to either support freezing the conflict and occupying the country forever, or cutting and running in the middle of the night like Trump did and letting bad actors like Turkey invade. And I think one thing I'm hearing throughout this event is that neither of those are good options. What has to be done is engagement and diplomacy to not prolong the war forever or hand it off to someone else, but to actually end it. So on that note, I see we are getting some questions in the Q&A. So we can start with that. Please send your questions to the Q&A feature, not to the chat. I'm going to start with our question from Frederick Kroll, who asks, in a recent piece that was shared widely, FPRI's Aaron Stein has argued that there is a tendency in the West to overestimate the domestic dimension and rally around the flag effects as a goal of Turkish foreign policy. Instead, he argues there are genuine security concerns among political elites in Turkey that should be understood as such. What do you make of that argument and how do you value it, especially given the role that Turkey plays in Northeast Syria? And Liesel, Frederick has addressed that question to you, but Hadil and Shiler, you could add on your answers if you want.
Yeah, so I guess I can kick that off. Yeah, I think Aaron's piece, in addition to Jihan Tuwal's piece, those are sort of two that people have been talking about quite a bit recently. And I think often what happens is that we sort of try to pin, it's like one or the other. It's like, it's either genuine security concerns or it's domestic politics, right? And what is really frustrating to me, and I think, you know, scholars who even more than I do study the way in which security threats become constructed, is that these two aren't inseparable. You know, there are lots of different definitions of security. There's border security, national security, regime security, which is what I've been emphasizing. The AKP's need to hold on to power. But I talked a little bit earlier about how Kurds in the AKP's eyes, and I'm specifically using the term Kurds and not just the PKK, because again, there's this larger effort to vilify all Kurds as being a security threat and a political threat, but how they go from being an interlocutor in a peace process to being a population that needs to be crushed with military force. And that is a process that happens such that security threats become constructed in ways that they didn't appear before. And so I think it's really important to understand what we mean by legitimate security concerns, by genuine security concerns. And I think there's a difference between the two. There can be a genuine perception that a group is a threat to another group, but from an outsider's perspective, and I don't like the word objective because again, you know, everything is sort of about perception, but I do not disagree that the AKP and the MHP genuinely perceive Kurds, and specifically the PKK, the YPG, and as they like to link sort of everything together, the PKK, the YPG, the PYD, even the HDP, even the CHP, the partners with the HDP, like there's this construction of this threat that I think comes from the political threat that we saw the Kurds become in 2015. And it's really important to understand that when the AKP comes into power in 2002, there is not this sense that Kurds are an inherent threat. There's not this sense that we need to erase Kurdish identity or that we need to focus on a military campaign against the Kurds. That happens much later. There are multiple attempts at, some more superficial than others, Kurdish opening, and then again, the peace process from 2012 to 2015. It's the way in which that ends the way in which the Kurds become a political threat. They remove support for Erdogan's presidential project. They are demonstrating their political capacity in the 2015 elections. Again, the AKP takes a hard nationalist turn. So for the ruling government in Turkey, they have genuine security concerns. But again, from the outside perspective, that doesn't make as much sense as it does within Turkey. And so I think it's really important not to say, oh, this is domestic politics, or, oh, this is genuine security concerns, because the two are inextricably linked. The AKP sees its continued regime durability in Turkey as threatened in multiple ways by opposition, and Kurds are part of that. So I think, and this, so I'll even abuse my privilege even more and say, if we're going to make some more recommendations, sit down and actually talk to Turkish officials. Take their concerns seriously. And maybe this is controversial to say in this forum, but understand why we have this case in which the Turkish government sees Kurds as a genuine security threat. Where does that come from? And how can that be managed? Because you're not going to sanction your way out of it. And sanctions are a highly problematic tool of foreign policy anyway. So trying to figure out why this perception of threat exists the way that it does, and taking those concerns seriously, in addition to talking to Kurds on the ground and taking their position seriously. So that gets to the dialogue aspect that was brought up. But I just really want to push away from this dichotomy that domestic politics and identity politics and genuine security concerns are not linked, because they absolutely are.
Yeah, well, that is, again, very happy. All of you, our speakers, are welcome to, go over your speaking privileges as much as you would like, because we always get wonderful recommendations when you do. Certainly taking each side seriously and trying to understand what each side actually wants is something that's really important. I know some of the issues with NATO and Sweden and Finland, which is our next question that I'll put to the panel when I get to that, have come about because Western officials didn't take Erdogan seriously when he said he had a problem with things like Kurdish, Swedish citizens of Kurdish heritage in Sweden's parliament, or the fact that pro-Kurdish demonstrations are allowed in European countries. People didn't understand the fact that for Erdogan and his government, that is a threat. And so they had downplayed it. They said, oh, he doesn't mean that, he wants F-16s. And that crisis went on because, he was not taken seriously about the fact that peaceful protests in foreign countries are something that his government finds threatening. And then on the other side, while we're taking Turkey seriously, I really liked your recommendation. We need to take Kurdish groups seriously too. And I want to apologize for saying Kurdish groups to refer to the SDF and the autonomous administration, especially with what we're looking at now with a potential attack on Manbij. Manbij is a majority Arab city. Kurds also live there. There are Circassians, Armenians, many different populations, but it is not an exclusively Kurdish city. The local SDF are formerly from the Free Syrian Army. They were moderate groups who remained moderate. They resisted being co-opted by Islamists, unlike other FSA groups in Manbij, and that's how they ended up with the SDF. So when we understand that what the autonomous administration wants is not a, quote unquote, separatist Kurdish state on Turkey's borders, but a decentralized and democratic Syria based on principles of, gender equality, cooperation between different peoples, religious freedom, all of that, like Khadil talked about, like Shalair talked about, we can see that when we take their side seriously, the picture looks a little bit different too. So those are really good recommendations. Our next question, and Hadil, you've had really good analysis on US and international policies, so maybe you want to look at this one. How much is Sweden and Finland being blocked by Ankara from joining NATO playing a part in this, if at all? It seems Biden and Western leaders are willing to sacrifice the Kurds to Turkey for the NATO membership of these countries. And that's from Justin Palacios.
Yes, as Lisa mentioned at the beginning of this conference, when you asked her why now, of course, Erdogan is making these threats now because he wants to use all the international developments connected to the war in Ukraine to take new areas from Syria, and of course to benefit him in his political campaign. So I think this is very connected. It's obvious that today for Biden administration, Ukraine is a priority. The unity of the NATO is a priority, but as the US and the West delayed for a very long time the Russian threats, looking at China, focusing on China and the Far East, I think it's very dangerous to ignore the Turkish threats, because also this is accumulating, and this will come to hunt back the US interests. So I think this is connected in a way or another, but also Erdogan here, I think he tried to block Finland and Sweden from the NATO because he wants to keep good relation with Russia, despite all the scene he's making around his country, that they're being very helpful for the NATO, they're being very helpful for the NATO unity to support Ukraine. I don't think he did enough. I don't think he was very helpful. I think Turkey was able to be way more helpful to Ukraine, but he did not, because he's very careful about his relation with Russia, and he's blocking Sweden and Finland from the NATO to make this as a favor for Russia and to maintain good relations with Russia, because his priority is Syria and his priority is the Kurds in general. So so I think he's focusing on that. I don't think his concerns about Sweden and Finland having protests for the Kurdish movements is very legitimate. A few days ago, we saw the foreign minister of Sweden saying that we were the first to sanction the PKK, and she said that the concerns of Turkey and Erdogan are not legitimate and are not serious. So what the US should do here is to be very careful about the Turkish-Russian relation and mutual interest, because I think until today, Turkey see Russia is a very important partner and player because Russia is, I can say, the main player in Syria, despite the talk today about Russia withdrawing some of its troops from Syria. I think it remains very important for the US. And I will connect this also with another question by Sarah, who is asking that Turkey is currently threatening Manbij and Tel Rifaat, who are protected by Russia. Their bases protected by Russia. So here the deal is more between Turkey and Russia, not the US, because the US has no presence in Tel Rifaat and Manbij. But the US should also understand that encircling SDF from the west and controlling Manbij and Rifaat will deteriorate the economic situation in northeast Syria. As I mentioned before, this is an area that has no crossing borders, and Tel Rifaat and Manbij is a very important and key locations for the autonomous administration. So I think the US has leverage, has the tools to pressure Turkey and Russia not to strike such a deal. And the US should rethink what happened in Ukraine and should rethink the importance of having and keeping its leverage in Syria, because looking around today in Iraq is not a safe region for the US troops anymore. We have a lot of the US allies in the region who are trying to cut deals and improve their relations with Russia, and it's very important for the US to maintain its leverage and ability to have things done in this area. And at this point, it's very important to be able to stop these threats and incursion, and to stop Turkey and Russia from cutting a deal that would make Turkey control Manbij and Tel Rifaat.
Thank you. That was very, very insightful. Liesl, Shalair, do either of you want to add on to that? Both Russia-focused questions that were brought up?
I think Hadil nailed it.
Okay. I really want to add something that once the war in Syria shifted its way to the civil war, and now when the Russia, Iran, interfered or came to Syria as defender and supporter of the regime. Of course, the situation was getting worse. Now, the form of the war that is happening on the ground turned from something to something else. Now it's all about the crossroads, all about oil, all about the gas pipes, all about the economic benefits. So Russia is trying its best to control the M4 road that is, come through Tel Rifaat, Manbij, to the northeast Syria, to Remaland. It is a very long trade road, and Russia is doing its best. Along with Turkey, there is always this competition to control the crossroads, the main gas pipes, the main petrol ways, in order to, stay more in the Syrian territory. This economical war happened after the invasion, the Russian invasion against Ukraine, and it affected so much Syria. So that is what I'm talking about. Now it's all about trade. It's all about economy. It's all about the roads and the competitions between Turkey, Russia, the Europe, and the gas and the petrol. The Syrian people has nothing to do what really now goes on the ground, unfortunately. Yes.
All right, then I think on that note, we are coming up on our end of this panel. And I don't think that I can think of a more important note to end it on than that the Syrian people at the end of the day are the ones who are impacted by this, who will be impacted if Turkey goes in. And, broadening this out towards some of the points that, all of our speakers have made, that this affects developments in Iraq, that this affects developments in Turkey. This even affects developments in Europe, as we've seen with Turkish officials now demanding that European countries actually change their laws as part of that NATO accession process. So this is an international problem. This possible incursion is a symptom of, some deep-seated dynamics, both within Syria, within Turkey, and at the international level. And I think that we've done a wonderful job covering that today, and not just going over what's happening, but also going over why it matters and what can be done. So I want to thank all of our panelists once again for their important analysis and insight and their policy recommendations. This webinar will be published on our website at kurdishpeace.org. So those who weren't able to see all of it, those who weren't able to be here will be able to watch it. And we will publish a summary with the recommendations and key points made by all of our speakers. So once again, I want to thank our panelists for joining us. Thank all of our attendees for being here as well. We're going to have a lot more events at the Kurdish Peace Institute, and we're going to be having a lot more of these conversations about many of the issues that were touched on here that could be an entire event by themselves. So keep following us, keep following our speakers, and thank you everyone for being here. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.